The knock came soft as a prayer, but it shattered Samuel's world like thunder. He'd been cleaning his rifle by lamplight, the same ritual he'd performed every night for 3 years, ever since the fever took Martha and left him alone in their cabin at the edge of nowhere. The knock was patient, deliberate, the kind that said whoever stood outside knew he was listening. Samuel's hands trembled as he set down the cleaning rod. Nobody came to his door anymore. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles through canyon country, and the town folk had long since given up on the broken man who'd buried his wife with his own hands. Samuel. The voice drifted through the wooden door like smoke through cracks, soft, familiar, impossible. His blood turned to ice water. He knew that voice the way he knew his own heartbeat, the way he knew the sound of Martha's laughter echoing through their cabin on Sunday mornings. But Martha was dead. He'd carved her name into the wooden cross himself, had spoken the words over her grave until his throat bled raw. "Samuel, please." The voice came again, patient as death itself. His legs moved without permission, carrying him to the door. His hand hovered over the latch, fingers shaking like autumn leaves. Through the gap beneath the door he could see the hem of a blue dress, the same cornflower blue Martha had worn on their wedding day. "I buried you," he whispered to the wood, his voice cracking like dried leather. "I buried you with my own hands." "I know," came the reply, and something in that voice, something broken and distant, made his chest cave in on itself. Samuel's hand found the latch. The metal felt cold as a gravestone under his palm. Behind that door stood either salvation or madness, and he could no longer tell the difference. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, thick with the weight of 3 years' worth of grief and whispered prayers to an empty sky. When he finally opened the door, the woman standing in his doorway looked exactly like his dead wife, except for her eyes, which held the hollow emptiness of someone who'd seen the other side of the grave. She stood in the moonlight like a ghost made flesh, wearing the same blue dress he'd buried her in, though now it hung loose on a frame too thin, too fragile. Her auburn hair caught the silver light the way he remembered, but her skin held the pallor of someone who'd spent too long underground. "Martha," the name fell from his lips like a prayer, like a curse. She didn't answer immediately. Instead she raised her left hand, and there, impossible, undeniable, was the simple gold band he'd placed on her finger 7 years ago. The ring he'd left on her hand when he'd laid her in the earth, when he'd covered her face with dirt and said goodbye to everything that mattered. "May I come in?" Her voice carried the same gentle cadence he remembered, but underneath lay something else, something hollow and strange that made his skin crawl. Samuel's mind reeled. He'd seen her die, held her hand as the fever burned through her like wildfire, felt her last breath whisper against his cheek. He'd dug her grave in the rocky soil behind their cabin, had lowered her wrapped body into the ground with his own trembling hands. "You're not real," he said, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. "You can't be real." "I'm cold, Samuel." She hugged her arms around herself, and the gesture was so perfectly Martha, the way she'd shiver by the fire on winter evenings, that his resolve crumbled like old paper. He stepped aside, and she walked past him into their cabin. The familiar scent of lavender and sage followed her, the same perfume she'd worn in life, but underneath it lurked something else, earth and darkness and the deep cold of places where sunlight never reached. She moved through their home like a memory made solid, touching familiar objects with reverent fingers. The quilt she'd sewn during their first winter, the tin cup he'd never been able to throw away, the rocking chair where she'd mended his shirts by lamplight. "How?" The words scraped from his throat, raw and desperate. Martha turned to face him, and in the lamplight he could see through her skin to the shadows beneath. "Some debts follow you past the grave, Samuel. Some promises bind deeper than death." Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, long and mournful. The sound raised the hair on Samuel's neck, because he'd never heard coyotes this close to the cabin before. They avoided this place now, had avoided it ever since Martha's burial. Even the wild things knew something wasn't right here. The morning brought riders, 3 of them, moving slow and deliberate through the canyon like vultures circling carrion. Samuel watched them approach from behind the cabin's single window, Martha standing silent as a shadow beside him. "They're coming for me," she said, her voice flat as still water. Samuel recognized the lead rider, Deputy Marshal Jake Corrigan, a hard man with eyes like winter stones. Behind him rode two others, Samuel didn't know, strangers with the look of bounty hunters, all leather and iron and barely contained violence. "What did you do?" Samuel asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want the answer. Martha's reflection in the window glass looked transparent, like morning mist. "What I had to do to come back to you." The riders drew closer, and Samuel could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands rested easy on their weapon grips. These weren't men coming for a social call. They rode like hunters who'd finally cornered their prey. "Samuel Fletcher," Corrigan's voice carried across the clearing like a gunshot. "We know she's in there. Send her out." Martha moved away from the window, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. "They think I killed a man," she said, matter of fact as discussing the weather. 3 nights ago in Tombstone. "They think I slit his throat in a hotel room and took his money." "Did you?" The question tore from Samuel's chest like a bullet. She looked at him with those hollow eyes, and for a moment her face flickered, showing something underneath that was hungry and desperate, and not quite human. "The dead have needs, Samuel. We get cold, we get hungry, we remember what it felt like to be warm." Outside the horses snorted and stamped. Samuel could hear the creak of leather, the soft jingle of spurs. Corrigan was a patient man, but not patient enough to wait all day. "Fletcher, you've got 30 seconds, then we're coming in." Martha moved to the far corner of the cabin, where shadows gathered thick as spilled ink. As she stepped into the darkness, her form became translucent, wavering like heat shimmer. "They can't take me back," she whispered. "Not back to the cold, not back to the dark. I won't go back." Samuel's hand found his rifle, though he couldn't say whether he meant to protect her or protect himself from her. The distinction seemed to matter less with each passing second. 29, 28, 27, wait. Samuel's voice stopped Martha as she faded into the shadows. "Before they come through that door, before everything changes, I need to know, are you really her?" Martha's form solidified slightly, became more real, more present. She stepped forward into the lamplight, and for a moment she looked exactly like the woman he'd married, the woman who'd laughed at his terrible jokes and mended his shirts and died in his arms while promising she'd find a way back to him. "Do you remember," she said softly, "the night before our wedding, when you couldn't sleep, and you found me sitting by the creek?" Samuel's breath caught. He remembered. She'd been crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming joy of having found someone who loved her completely. He'd asked her what was wrong, and she'd said she was afraid it was all a dream. "You told me," Martha continued, "that love doesn't end just because life does, that if there was any way to come back to each other, we'd find it." Her hand reached toward him, pale fingers trembling. "I found it, Samuel. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't clean, but I found it." He looked at her wedding ring, their wedding ring, catching the lamplight. The simple gold band they'd saved months to buy, working extra hours and skipping meals until they could afford it. She'd never taken it off, not even in death. "What you've become," he said carefully, "what you've done, that's not the woman I married." "No," she agreed, and there was infinite sadness in her voice, "but it's what she became to keep her promise to you." Outside, Corrigan shouted, "Time's up, Fletcher." Martha moved closer, and despite everything, despite the wrongness of her, the hollowness behind her eyes, the cold that followed her like a shroud, Samuel felt his heart breaking all over again, because this was Martha, changed, twisted, hungry for things that should terrify him, but still Martha, still the woman who died whispering his name. "I can't protect you from them," he said. "I know." She reached up and touched his face with fingers cold as winter earth. "But you can choose to remember me as I was, not as I've become." The cabin door exploded inward. Corrigan and his men burst through with guns drawn, ready for a fight. But Martha was already gone, faded back into shadows and memory, leaving only the faint scent of lavender and the echo of her voice. "Search everywhere," Corrigan ordered. "She was here. I can feel it." They tore his cabin apart looking for her, overturned furniture, ripped up floorboards, even checked the space beneath the roof. But Martha had vanished like morning mist, leaving no trace except the lingering cold in the air and the faint impression of bare feet in the dust. Corrigan stood in the center of the destruction, his face hard as granite. "Where is she, Fletcher?" Samuel met his eyes steadily. "I buried my wife 3 years ago, Marshal. She's in the ground where she belongs. 3 people saw her in Tombstone. 3 people saw Martha Fletcher slit a man's throat and walk away with his money." Corrigan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But here's the strange part. All 3 witnesses swore she looked exactly like she did the day she died. Not a day older, not a day different." Samuel said nothing. What could he say? That the dead sometimes kept their promises, that love could reach across the grave and drag the departed back into the world of the living, that his wife had become something hungry and desperate in her need to return to him. "You see her again," Corrigan said. "You send word. This isn't over." After they left, Samuel sat alone in his destroyed cabin, holding the only thing they hadn't found, Martha's wedding ring, which she'd slipped from her finger and pressed into his palm during their last moment together. The metal was cold, so cold it burned against his skin. That night he dug a second grave beside Martha's original resting place, not for a body, there was no body to bury, but for the ring and for the last piece of hope he'd carried for 3 impossible years. As he covered the small hole with earth, he whispered the words he should have said when she'd stood in his doorway. "I release you, Martha. I release you from your promise." The wind through the canyon carried no answer, but somehow the oppressive cold that had settled over his land began to lift. The coyotes returned to their familiar territories. The shadows in his cabin's corners became ordinary shadows once again. Years later, when Samuel was an old man telling stories to his neighbors' children, he would speak of Martha as she had been in life, laughing, loving, full of light and warmth. He never mentioned the hollow-eyed woman who'd come to his door wearing his dead wife's face, because some stories are too heavy for small shoulders to carry. But sometimes on quiet nights when the moon was dark and the wind sang through the canyon, he would touch his ring finger where a thin white band of skin still showed, and remember the woman who'd loved him enough to crawl back from the grave, and the greater love it had taken to let her go.